In the autumn of 1957, a 10-year-old boy named Russell Cord walked into a cornfield outside Enid, Oklahoma, and vanished for 48 hours. When he came back, he walked straight to the kitchen table, sat down, and began to speak. His mother, Dottie Cord, stood frozen at the sink. His father, Earl, came in from the porch. They listened for several minutes before either of them moved. What Russell was speaking was not English. It was not any language either of them had encountered in their lives. It was not random. It had grammar. It had rhythm. It had the unmistakable architecture of meaning. And before he disappeared, witnesses say he had followed something into that field, something that wasn't human. That's the starting point. Everything unravels from there. Let me begin with what is documented and work outward from there. On the morning of October 3rd, 1957, Russell Cord, 10 years old, the eldest child of Earl and Dottie Cord of rural Garfield County, Oklahoma, stepped off his family's back porch at approximately 5:40 in the morning before sunrise, while the October mist was still sitting heavy on the rows. He was wearing his school clothes. He had not eaten breakfast. His mother, who was already up and working in the kitchen, saw him cross the yard through the window above the sink. She saw him stop at the field's edge. She saw him look upward and to the right, not forward, not at the ground, but upward, at something she initially assumed was a bird or a kite, or some reflection off the pre-dawn sky she couldn't make sense of at that hour. And then she saw what it actually was. Dottie Cord described the figure to her pastor, Reverend Alton Graves of the First Baptist Church of Enid, in a private conversation sometime in October or November of 1957. Reverend Graves, who died in 1989, had a habit, apparently well known within his congregation, of writing detailed notes after significant pastoral conversations. His notebooks passed to the Garfield County Historical Society through a 1991 estate donation. I located the relevant entry in the spring of 2023. Graves wrote, "Dorothy told me she saw a figure at the field's margin. She was firm and clear, and not the sort of woman to embellish. She said it was taller than any man she'd known. The head was out of proportion to the body, too large, too smooth. The limbs were elongated in a way that made her think of something submerged in water. The skin," she used the word skin, "was pale grey, the colour of old ash. It appeared to be looking at the boy, and the boy appeared to be looking at it with no fear whatsoever. She said that was the detail that frightened her most, not the figure, the boy's lack of fear, no fear whatsoever." She called for Earl. By the time he reached the window, Russell was inside the rows, and the figure, if it had been standing at the field's edge at all, was gone. They searched the field that morning, both of them, calling his name for 2 hours before Earl drove to the Garfield County Sheriff's substation on Route 81. Gone for 48 hours. The official record, what survives of it, shows a missing child report filed on October 3rd, 1957. Case number GC11457. It appears in the substation's intake log. What it does not show is any substantive follow-up documentation, no search coordination records, no interviews with neighbouring farms, none of which were far, no reports from the State Highway Patrol, which would have been standard practice for a missing child in a rural county. The file, as it exists today, contains the intake form and a single handwritten note reading, "Resolved, child returned." That's it. That's the record. 2 lines for a 48-hour disappearance of a 10-year-old boy in October 1957. The deeper I went into that file, the more those 2 lines felt less like a conclusion and more like a door that had been closed from the outside. Russell Cord came back on the morning of October 5th. He did not come back the way Eldon Mercer came back, standing still at the property edge, facing the house, waiting to be found. Russell came back walking fast, purposefully, as though he were late for something he'd scheduled in advance. Earl was repairing a fence on the south side of the property when he saw the boy coming out of the rows. He later told Reverend Graves, another notebook entry, another entry I've held with my own hands, that the first thing he noticed was Russell's expression. Not distress, not confusion, not the glassy vacancy of a child in shock. Russell looked, in Earl's word, informed. Like he'd just come from school, Earl said. Like he'd just been told something that settled a question he'd had for a long time. The family went inside. Dottie made breakfast she later admitted she was too shaken to eat. They sat around the kitchen table, and Russell Cord began to speak. What came out of his mouth was not English. It was not anything Earl or Dottie could identify, and between the two of them they had exposure to some Spanish, to fragments of the German Earl's grandfather had spoken, to the rhythms of French from a neighbour who'd come up from Louisiana. None of those. Something entirely outside the inventory of sounds they associated with human language, and yet unmistakably organised. Not babbling, not glossolalia of the kind Dottie might have associated with certain church meetings she'd attended as a child. This had shape, this had internal logic. This had what she could only describe to Graves as sentences. She said it had sentences, Graves wrote. She said she could feel where one ended and the next began, even though she couldn't understand a word of it. She said it was like listening to a piece of music you'd never heard and being able to tell nonetheless that it was music. Like listening to music and being able to tell nonetheless that it was music. Russell spoke, for Broim's, Earl's estimate, close to 20 minutes. Then he stopped. He looked at his parents, and he said, in ordinary English, in his own voice, without any apparent transition, "I'm hungry. Can I have eggs?" And that was it. He ate his eggs. He went to his room. He never spontaneously returned to the other language again. Not unprompted, not in front of his family. But he returned to it. This is where the story stops being a family mystery and starts becoming something I find genuinely impossible to account for. In the weeks following his return, Russell's teacher at Jefferson Elementary School in Enid, a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, whose first name I have not been able to confirm, contacted Earl and Dottie about a behavioural irregularity. Russell was, she said, writing things in his notebooks that were not classwork. Not doodling, not distracted drawings, not the ordinary wanderings of a bored 10-year-old mind. He was writing in a consistent, structured, apparently phonetic script that she had never seen before, and that bore no resemblance to any language she could identify. She had shown the examples to the school principal, a Mr. Dale Forsyth. Forsyth had shown them, she understood, to someone at the county level. She didn't know who. She thought the Cords should know. I want to stay with this detail for a moment, because here is what it implies. Within weeks of Russell Cord's return from a 48-hour disappearance, examples of a written, apparently constructed language were being circulated through the educational administrative structure of Garfield County. And at some point, those examples reached someone whose title and affiliation Mrs. Hargrove either did not know or was not told. Who was that person? What did they see in Russell's notebook pages that made them worth escalating? And this is the question I cannot dismiss. What happened to those pages? I contacted the Enid School District's Archives Office in 2022. Jefferson Elementary closed in 1971, and its records were transferred to the district central office. The district's archivist was courteous and thorough. She located a student file for Russell Cord covering the years 1956 through 1958. The file contained his enrolment information, his attendance records, and 2 report cards. It did not contain any notation about an unusual behavioural incident. It did not contain any reference to a meeting with the principal. It did not contain, needless to say, any examples of the script. Not missing in the sense of misfiled, missing in the sense of never having been placed there. The evidence suggests something larger than a school administrator's curious moment with a strange child's notebook. It suggests that what Russell wrote was taken seriously enough to be extracted from the paper record before that record could be read by anyone who came looking later. And that's where the shape of this becomes impossible to ignore. In 1961, 4 years after Russell's return, a linguist named Dr. Harmon Price, then an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma in Norman received a package through the university mail. He described this package in a letter to a colleague, a Dr. Frederica Baines at the University of Chicago, in November of 1961. That letter is in the University of Chicago's archive. I found it through a search of Baines's collected correspondence, which was donated to the university library in 1988. The package, Price wrote, contained 12 pages of handwritten script. No cover letter, no return address. A Norman postmark. The pages contained what appeared to him to be a consistent orthographic system, meaning a writing system with internal rules that did not correspond to any known linguistic family. He noted specific features: a left-to-right directionality, a set of what appeared to be base characters modified by diacritical marks, and a consistent use of spatial grouping that suggested word-level and phrase-level structure. He had, he told Baines, never encountered anything like it. "I have shown these pages to 3 colleagues," he wrote, "and none of us can place it. It is not a cipher of any known language. It is not a constructed language of the type one encounters from eccentric correspondence. It has the quality of something that grew, something with a history, an evolution, a community of speakers, rather than something invented. A community of speakers. I want to be transparent about the evidentiary chain here because it is imperfect. I cannot prove with certainty that the 12 pages Price received were Russell Cord's school notebook pages. The timing is suggestive. 4 years is a long gap, though not an inexplicable one if the pages spent time in administrative hands before someone decided, for whatever reason, to route them to an academic. The Norman postmark places the origin in the same state, and the description of the script's characteristics, phonetic, structured, internally consistent, matches what Mrs. Hargrove reported seeing. But I cannot close that gap with documents that exist, and the reason I cannot close it is that Dr. Harmon Price's academic file at the University of Oklahoma, which I requested through the university's records office, shows that he resigned his position in December of 1961, 1 month after writing to Baines for what the file describes as personal reasons. His personnel record contains no further detail. His subsequent whereabouts are unclear. He did not publish again in any linguistics journal that I can find. Frederica Baines's subsequent letters in the Chicago archive contain no further mention of him. He received those pages in the fall of 1961. He told a colleague about them, and then he stepped sideways out of the documented world, quietly and completely, within 30 days. The pattern repeats with an unsettling uniformity. Contact with whatever Russell Cord brought back from that field, followed by a clean, quiet disappearance from the record. Not death, not scandal, just absence. Just the clean removal of a thread before it can be pulled. Russell Cord did not follow the path of Eldon Mercer into total silence. That is the crucial difference between these two cases, and it is a difference I've spent a long time thinking about. Russell spoke. He finished school, studied agricultural management at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, married a woman named Helen Prater in 1969, and farmed a modest operation in Garfield County until the late 1980s. He was, by all accounts from the people I spoke to who knew him in those years, a quiet but functional man. Friendly enough, kept to himself more than most. Had a quality, his wife Helen told me, of always seeming to be listening for something that wasn't in the room. Helen Cord agreed to speak with me in 2023. She was 78. Russell had died in 2019. She said he told her about the field incident on their third date, not as a confession, but as a practical disclosure, as though it were a medical history she deserved to know before proceeding. He told her he had followed something into the field. He told her he had been somewhere for 2 days that he could not describe in English. He told her that when he came back he had known for a period of several months how to speak what he called the other one, the other language, but that it had faded the way a dream fades, not all at once, but in segments, one phrase disappearing at a time until only traces remained. He said the worst part, Helen told me, was that the fading felt like a loss, like losing a second language you'd grown up with. He said it wasn't like forgetting. It was like being prevented, like the vocabulary was still there, behind something, and he just couldn't reach it anymore. Like being prevented. Not forgetting. Prevented. I want to sit with that word because I think it matters. Forgetting implies a passive process, implies natural decay, neurological erosion, the ordinary entropy of memory. Prevented implies an active mechanism, implies something applied from the outside, implies a door that was not simply allowed to close but was closed by something at a particular moment, for a reason. Helen also told me something Russell had shared only with her, something he'd never told his parents, never told anyone except his wife in the privacy of their marriage. He said that during the 2 days in the field, he had not been alone. He had been with, she searched for the right word, and then used the one he had used, students. Others, not the beings themselves, other children. 3 or 4 of them, he'd thought, though he couldn't be precise. Children from what felt like different times, different eras. Children who spoke when they arrived in the languages of wherever they'd come from, and who left speaking something new, a classroom, an intake, a curriculum. What are the implications of that? If Russell Cord's account has any relationship to what actually occurred in that field, and I am not telling you it does, I am asking you to sit with the possibility, then we are not looking at isolated incidents of contact. We are looking at something organised, something repeated, something with a pedagogical intent, not random encounters, a programme. Because here's what I found when I went looking specifically for cases that resembled Russell's. Not the silence cases, not the Eldon Mercer pattern, but the language cases, the returns accompanied by speech, rather than its absence. In September of 1954, a 12-year-old girl named Vera Hutchins disappeared from her family's property near Muskogee in eastern Oklahoma. She was gone for 3 days. When she came back, she spoke, briefly and apparently fluently, in a tongue her parents could not identify before lapsing back into English. The case was documented in a single paragraph in the Muskogee Phoenix, dated September 19, 1954. The paragraph is cautious, almost embarrassed. It notes the disappearance and return and includes the phrase, exhibited unusual speech patterns upon return, which subsided within hours. That's everything. That's the full weight of the newspaper's attention. In June of 1960, 3 years after Russell, 3 years before the Kansas cases, a boy named Clarence Adler, age 11, vanished near Altus in Jackson County, Oklahoma. Gone for 2 days, came back speaking something unfamiliar. His older brother, a man named Roy Adler, who was living in Lawton when I tracked him down in 2022, told me that Clarence had spoken something like music and something like math at the same time for approximately a day after his return before dropping back entirely into English. Roy was 17 when this happened. He remembers it with the precision of someone who was old enough to be frightened and young enough to have had no framework for the fear. He said his parents never discussed it afterward. My mother acted like it didn't happen, he told me. Like if she didn't name it, it would stay in the category of things that didn't happen. 3 Oklahoma cases, rural settings, children between 10 and 13, disappearances measured in days, return accompanied by fluency, however brief, in an unidentifiable language, and then either suppression by the family, suppression by the local record, or both simultaneously. 3 cases I found. How many I didn't find. This raises something that I consider the most troubling implication of everything I've uncovered. If there are 3 documented Oklahoma cases and 4 documented Kansas cases from this period, all sharing the same core structure, all subject to the same pattern of official disinterest, followed by administrative omission, what is the actual scope? What exists in Arkansas, in Nebraska, in the rural expanses of Missouri and Iowa, and the Texas Panhandle? What is in the records of small county sheriff's offices and rural school districts across the American interior, waiting for someone to look at it as a pattern, rather than as individual anomalies? Because that's what this becomes once you look at it the right way. Not a collection of strange stories, but a distribution. A geographic and temporal spread that looks less like random occurrence and more like something that follows a logic we don't yet have the framework to understand. Once that shape resolves itself, you cannot make it dissolve again. It stays. It accumulates. Russell Cord spent 62 years with the memory of a language he could no longer speak. Helen told me that in the last years of his life, when his health was declining and he slept more than he was awake, he would sometimes murmur in his sleep. Not English, not anything she recognized. She said she started recording these murmurs on her phone in the last months because she couldn't explain why, because something in her knew they mattered. She played me 12 seconds of one of the recordings over the phone in the spring of 2023. What I heard was structured, rhythmic, unmistakably intentional in its sonority, even filtered through sleep and age and a phone speaker. It sounded like nothing I could place. She said she sent a recording to the University of Oklahoma's Linguistics department in the fall of 2022, asking if anyone could help her identify it. She never received a response, not a rejection, not a referral, not a polite note explaining that the sample was too brief or too degraded for analysis. Nothing. The silence was total, and it arrived immediately, and it has not broken. What is in that 12 seconds of audio? What did Russell Cord's sleeping mind reach back for, past 6 decades of English and marriage and farming and ordinary life, and pull forward into sound? What was preserved in whatever part of the human mind stores things that were placed there by something other than experience? And why? If this is nothing, if this is a sick man dreaming in gibberish, why did a 12-second phone recording sent to a university linguistics department produce the same quality of response as a letter to the FBI or a FOIA request or a school district archive query? Nothing. Immediate and complete and seamlessly unbroken nothing. Is it possible that what the beings communicated to these children was not incidental, not a side effect of encounter, not a contamination, not a malfunction? Is it possible that language was the point? That what was passed into Russell Cord and Vera Hutchins and Clarence Adler in those fields in those days was precisely and deliberately a linguistic payload, something intended to be carried, to be held, to be preserved in whatever substrate of the human brain can hold a thing it was never built to hold. And if the language was the message, if the language was the transmission, what was it transmitting? Was it a record, a set of instructions, a key to something that requires a speaker to unlock it? Was it a story? Was it, in some taxonomy, we don't have the cognitive